This is a recording of a Pages of Hackney event that took place on Wednesday the 31st of May 2023, when we welcomed Octavia Bright and Carrie Plitt to the Round Chapel Old Schoolrooms to celebrate the publication of Octavia's debut memoir, This Ragged Grace, published by Canongate Books. Octavia Bright is a writer and broadcaster. She co-hosts Literary Friction, the literary podcast and NTS radio show with Carrie Plitt. Recommended by the New York Times, Guardian, BBC Culture, Electric Literature, Sunday Times and others, it has run for 10 years and has listeners worldwide. Octavia has also presented programmes for BBC Radio 4, including Open Book, and hosts literary events for bookshop publishers and festivals, such as the Cheltenham Literature Festival, and events for the South Bank Centre. Her writing has been published in a number of magazines, including The White Review, Harper's Bazaar, Elle, Wazafiri, Some Such Stories, and the Sunday Times, amongst others. She has a PhD from the Spanish department at UCL, where she wrote about hysteria and desire in Spanish cinema. Carrie Plitt is a literary agent at Felicity Bryan Associates, where she represents a list of award-winning fiction and non-fiction authors, and is also the co-host of the podcast Literary Friction with Octavia Bright.
Hi, everyone. We are so excited to be here. Hi, Octavia.
Hi, darling.
Good to see you.
Freaking out a little bit, in a good way.
And thank you, Joe, for that lovely introduction. We have realized that this is the first time we're doing an event just the two of us without an author. So, we obviously have an author.
Sick burn, Carrie Plitt.
It's going really well so far.
Going great, darling. Yeah, let's keep it up.
But thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, Pages of Hackney.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
I can't wait to talk to Octavia about this wonderful, wonderful book. We were just talking in the kitchen beforehand, and I said, I would have told you if I thought it was bad. And I think it's absolutely amazing. So
yeah.
If you haven't read it already, please, there are copies on sale afterwards, and Octavia, I think, is going to be signing them.
I will. I've been practicing my signature.
Yes.
And also, just like a word to the wise, if you're a writer, get you some friends who will tell you if your work is a piece of shit, because it makes it much more relaxing when you actually publish.
But yeah, as Joe said, I'm going to start with a question. Octavia will probably do a few readings throughout the interview just to give you a sense of the book, not too long, and then at the end we'll be having some questions.
That was a directive, wasn't it? Not too long.
Yeah, and I will shut you down if you have a comment, not a question. So you are warned. But also we welcome your questions. Please ask them. So I think let's just start.
Yeah,
let's get into it. First, I want to ask you how the book took shape. So it's a memoir. It's about recovery, but it's also about your dad and caring for him when he had Alzheimer's. So how did those two stories come together for you?
They started with the recovery strand. I was working on something else. I was trying to write a very complicated avant-garde piece of writing about an iconography of hysteria, and it was kind of based on my thesis research, and I was getting very kind of tangled up in it. And then the pandemic hit, and libraries were not really available. And I realized I was treading water in my own old work. You know, it was like a security blanket to stay in that territory. And my agent actually sort of suggested trying something else. And I'd written about my father, and I'd written about recovery in a number of essays and articles. And they'd flowed very easily, sort of spiritually, I guess, you know, intellectually, I wasn't getting in my own way with my brain, let's say. It was very much from the heart. And so she suggested kind of returning to those themes and seeing what would come of it. And I was quite hesitant, and she's a very smart woman, and she said, just write 3,000 words and see what happens. And that basically became the first part of the first chapter. And then I was thinking a lot about the theme of recovery, and I was thinking, okay, how do I build this into a bigger story, and how do I want to tell it? And my father had Alzheimer's. He'd had Alzheimer's for a number of years by the time I got to this stage. And I realized that you can't write about recovery while also loving someone who can't recover from an illness. Without bringing it into the question, it just felt like it wouldn't be the full picture. And I realized that in order to tell the story of kind of coming back to myself, I had to talk about that in relation to this person I loved disappearing from himself and from us. And then, you know, you have to write a proposal, and it's like having a whip cracked around your ideas, and it's very useful, and I found that very difficult, but it helped me figure out the building blocks and the shape. I had no idea where it was going to end up when I began, which I find very exciting. But
it's very exciting. You wouldn't know it from reading the book, because there's this kind of neat trajectory in a way where you and your father meet in the middle, and I thought that was very poignant and very moving, and it works really well in terms of the structure, thinking about those two things in tandem. But let's talk a little bit more about the structure.
Okay.
So each chapter is a year after recovery. So we go from year 1 to year 7, basically. And each chapter is also focusing on a place. And so I wanted to ask you about why was it important to you to write not only a year, a point in time, but also a location? And did you have any favorites?
Stromboli is my favorite. Stromboli, if you don't know about it, is a volcanic island in Italy. It's off the coast of Sicily. And it is a place I went when I was very newly sober and very raw and tender. And it was a place of like extraordinary natural beauty at any point, but especially when I was that porous. I had a spiritual experience with the volcano, basically, is what I'm trying to say. I recommend it. It's a good thing to do with your life. Actually, I'm going to just do a little bit of a reading here, and then we'll come back to it. So this is right in the first chapter. My very dear friend Kate and I, who is American, she's a New Yorker, we met in Italy, and we went to Stromboli, and here we are arriving. Kate and I arrived in Ginostra by water taxi, a wooden motorboat powered by a local man named Frank, gruff voice, wide grin, strong hands, who we met at the main port. There are no cars on the island, and you can't reach the tiny settlement, a former fishing village, any other way. Almost unbearable joy pulsed through me as salty air blew my hair across my face, and we buffeted against the crests of perfectly formed little waves. The water was the deepest blue, many shades darker than the skull on my altar, and dense as velvet. The postman on Stromboli was a stringy German man with silver hair and 2 donkeys who carried the parcels and letters up the island's steep, zigzagging paths. Their saddles were fitted with panniers in the blue and yellow livery of the Italian postal service, and we soon discovered that they did not like being stroked while they were at work. We heard a rumor that the German postman's wife was a philosopher who'd studied with Theodor Adorno, a fact I found romantic because I had encountered his work during my master's. But beyond the fact he was against capitalism, all I really remembered was that he looked like a serious bespectacled egg. At the time, I made a point of looking up the photographs of every male philosopher and cultural critic on the course, fed up that men could be known for their ideas alone, while women were mostly known by their bodies first. How romantic, I thought, to live here on the edge of this active volcano with a brain full of anti-capitalist philosophy. How free they must be. Imagine a life not governed by mindless consumption. Perhaps living in Ginostra meant you could almost escape it altogether. There are no billboards, no advertisements. There are 2 little shops, one where you can buy dried things, capers, olives, and tinned tomatoes, pasta, onions, and crackers, and one that sells fresh produce which comes in with the boats and is therefore less reliable. Nearby there is a church, outside which there is a terrace where everyone gathers to watch the sunset and share an aperitivo in the evenings. Up the hill, a couple of restaurants, not much else. It was on that terrace outside the church, with the sun hanging orange and low in the sky, that I got talking to a French woman named Fleur, a journalist who'd been covering the migration crisis in the Mediterranean for a French news agency. She'd been coming to Stromboli to decompress for several years. I don't know how it happened, but we soon found we were talking about love. She used the word lover with a sincerity I admired, certain I could never pull it off. But Fleur's lovers were not satisfying her. In fact, what she was telling me was a story of deep dissatisfaction, of an unfillable void, which was a story I knew well. "I love it here," She told me in her soft voice, "It's so calm." Yes, I agreed, it is so calm here at the foot of an active volcano. I wondered if Fleur and I were desert flowers and could only flourish under arid conditions. So there is Stromboli, a place that made an enormous impression on me. In fact, I have postcards with Stromboli on it, which the publisher printed, so I have some of them to give people afterwards. But yeah, it was a moment in time, and it was a very unique place, obviously extremely different. I'm from London, so I'm used to the city, and the contrast between these two places became very important and seemed to reflect my state of mind. But I think also I wanted to write a book about lived experience, but I also wanted to write a book about ideas. And they needed to be anchored in place in order for them not to just become completely abstract, which I have a tendency to do. And the volcano it's an image, it's a symbol, it's real. It had a huge impression on me. It also kind of lives in it's a geographic location, it's also a frame of mind, and it felt like an interesting metaphor for addiction. It felt like an interesting metaphor for denial, the things we try and avoid. I mean, who goes on holiday on an active volcano? Like, honestly, it really didn't occur to me that it could erupt at any moment, and it did, and a few years later it really did, and somebody died. And so I think it's an interesting symbol. And the other places, they really came into their own once I'd started writing that piece, because I loved writing about Stromboli, and I loved thinking about my body in that place and how I related to it and what that then brought out in terms of the ideas. And I realized that I wanted every chapter to have quite a different sort of energy to it, because also I found that the different years in recovery were very different to one another, because you especially at the beginning, you're in this experience of propulsive change. It is quite rapid, and it's very intense to begin with, and I found it's evened out over the years, but I wanted to bring that into the writing, and it felt like a good way to do it.
Yeah, and in fact, you said to me that when you started writing this book, it was the Stromboli chapter, so that's kind of where you started from.
Yeah.
And then I can see how that becomes a template, but obviously it changes so much over time with the structure. I mean, was that always the structure, those 7 years?
Yeah, I always thought, I didn't know it was necessarily going to end in 7, but I thought 7 chapters feels like a manageable number. And the number 7 has a lot of interesting symbolism about it, and I thought, oh, that would be quite neat. I can kind of map that onto it. And then, you know, as you'll find when you read the book, things changed and it slightly blows that out of the water. We can come to that.
Yeah. So I want to talk about recovery and addiction, because that is a big part of this, and we've hinted that already. And I want to ask you about addiction first. I really liked your description in the book of it, that counter to a lot of people's beliefs about addiction, the truth is that once it sets in, addiction is not about feeling good, it's about not feeling terrible. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that, because I thought that was so well expressed and so interesting.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I speak very much from my own experience, but it is an experience that has been shared by other friends in recovery and other recovering people I've met. I think there is this very old-fashioned idea that, you know, succumbing to addiction is about having a weakness of character or being morally inferior in some way. Addiction is not a moral affliction. I feel like we're amongst friends here. I can't imagine anyone in this room considers it a moral affliction. But people really do, and people judge you very much for living with addiction. I've had some interesting responses to that in my life, you know. One woman said to me, "I can't believe a nice middle-class woman like you." And I was like, "What the fuck do you mean? Have you not met all these drunk judges? I mean, come on." But it is interesting. People show their arse, really, when they talk to you about addiction. And I wanted to get into that because I wanted to show that, first of all, I think there are lots of people who live in an addictive way, but their addiction is not something that is judged badly. Like, many people are addicted to work, many people are addicted to exercise. A lot of people live with addictions to food or addictions to not eating that cause them various levels of distress, but often the distress is very internal. When you become addicted to something like alcohol or drugs or sex, it's much more external, the dysfunction, and it tends to whip other people into it in a way that becomes very painful. But the idea that we live in a world where addiction is a moral problem is so mad to me, because we've actually constructed a world where living is very painful for a lot of people a lot of the time. And we reach for things to make it less painful. And sometimes those things are profoundly dysfunctional, and sometimes they're less dysfunctional. So I wanted to get into it. And actually, I wrote this scene. It was important to me to write more about recovery than to write about the chaos of addiction, of being inside it, because I find that very boring. Having lived it, it's very boring. It might be sexy for a minute, and it's just a mess, and it's just the same mess again and again and again. Whereas recovery is it's an open-ended experience that has limitless variation in it. But I knew in order to make the recovery story worth it for people, there had to be some description of the chaos. And that's weird when you start thinking about your own life in terms of like narrative value. It's an interesting exercise. I recommend it. But I wrote this scene about craving, which came from a very powerful memory and like thing that I lived through. But it's about craving in recovery. It's not about craving in addiction. And I'm going to read it because I think it sort of answers the question. A little bit of a setup. So very early in recovery, I stopped drinking, and then this voice came to the fore in my head, and I gave him a name. He's called Wormtongue. He's a real wanker. He likes to undermine.
He's a wanker.
Isn't he?
I hated him in the book. It's like, oh.
When my friends first read this, I got so many texts being like, Wormtongue's a dick.
Yeah.
Wormtongue is my inner voice, and I think a lot of people can relate to having an undermining inner voice, a harsh inner critic. I know not everybody does, but I think when people recognize it, they recognize it very powerfully. So anyway, Wormtongue appears in this scene. I was newly sober, desperately trying to feel better, trying to do the right thing. So I signed up for a meditation course. I was still at university at the time doing my thesis, my PhD. And classic addict behavior went from 0 to 100. Not like try a little 20-minute mindfulness session every now and again. I was like, I'm going deep in meditation for an hour every morning with this teacher. So anyway, this is what happened. On arrival the next Monday, our teacher gave us each a custard cream. Judging by the reactions of the others in the room, it was only me who regularly ate biscuits for breakfast. They received theirs with reverence and curiosity, while I went to put mine straight in my mouth. Wait, said the teacher, not yet, not yet, as I fumbled with the biscuit and felt a hot blush flourish over my nose and across my cheeks. Greedy guts, Wormtongue said. Close that big, messy mouth. Our teacher explained we were to try an exercise in meditative eating. Behold the biscuit, he said. Turn it over in your hands. Take in every millimeter, every ridge. What's the texture like? And the smell? Breathe it in. Go slow. There's no hurry. I was longing to eat it, but I did as he said, examined the sand-colored rectangle with my eyes, my fingers, noticed the little cushion of sweet white cream sandwiched between the two outer biscuits, followed their raised swirling pattern, traced the words custard and cream with the tip of my forefinger. I breathed in its scent, sugary, sickly, and waited for permission to put it in my mouth. Take a taste of the biscuit, said our teacher. Pay attention to the texture and the flavor. I bit off a modest corner, enjoyed the crunch, then crumble of sweet and salty matter, and felt a tiny rush as the sugar melted on my tongue. Wormtongue said, more. More was what I wanted. I looked around at my fellow meditators and saw them all restrained and thoughtful, nibbling delicately, eyes closed, brows furrowed into tiny erudite frowns as though tasting a fine wine. They were absorbed in the moment, entirely consumed with biscuit tasting, which was the point of the exercise, presence through sensation. But Wormtongue and I were already lost to our craving for more. Furtive, I took another bite. I waited for an exquisite pleasure to invade my senses, like Proust and his interminable Madeleine. I found nothing but irritation. It appeared like a pressure behind the eyes, ran down my neck, arms, fingers, churned in my stomach. More. The disease of more, I'd heard it called and knew that I had it. I wanted to be transported by the poetry of the custard cream to some higher plane of feeling and felt impatient for my own involuntary memory to strike and elevate me. My love of biscuits came from my father, who'd once worked for a biscuit company, which meant in my childhood the house had been full of biscuits. My uncle even had 2 ginger tomcats called the Ginger Biscuits. There must be hundreds of dormant biscuit-related memories waiting to be triggered by the scent and flavor. But craving blots everything else out. Nothing makes me feel so mortal as the feeling of more. Powerless, I put the rest of the biscuit in my mouth.
What a cliffhanger. No, I think you get a sense from that reading of how, I love how this book is so sensory. You know, we're really in that moment with you with the biscuit, but it's also, it has this other level of wisdom. And you're so good at pulling in and out. I shouldn't have said that.
You should have said that. It's okay. The biscuit scene is kind of erotic. It's okay.
It was a little erotic.
It's
It's also very funny, and that's the thing with this book is it's legitimately funny, and it's full of joy and love and
Biscuit.
life and biscuits and biscuits. But I want to ask you about recovery. You were talking a little bit about it in your answer before, and recovery is such an interesting thing because it means so many different things in our culture, to an individual, in terms of addiction as well. And I wonder, when you sat down and thought, I want to write about recovery, what did you want to show about it? And, you know, was there anything you really wanted to avoid when you were thinking about recovery as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's hard. It's hard to know. It's easy to post-rationalize, right? It's hard to know what the ideas were when I was conceiving of them and what they are now, having done it. But I know I wanted to write about it in the sense that, you know, the wedding comes at the end of the rom-com, and everyone knows the wedding is the hard bit. Recovery often comes at the end of an addiction story, and I think I felt a hunger for a different kind of way of thinking about addiction, where addiction is the prologue and recovery is the story. And when I first got sober, you know, I'm a reader, so I looked for books, I looked for other people's experiences to sort of help me make sense of it. And there was so much out there about addiction that really gets into the gnarly experience of it. And a lot of that writing was very helpful to me. But also, I think that it's difficult not to glamorize something when you write about it, even if you're writing about this experience from the perspective of someone who isn't doing it anymore and doesn't want to carry it with them. It's a complicated thing to kind of put something down into words, to turn it into literature, to put it into a commodity that then gets passed around. I think these are questions it's worth asking. What are the experiences that you want to kind of crystallize in that way and offer to the world, and what happens when you do that? And I felt that when I first got sober, I mean, I was 26, so I was very young and terrified of having a boring life and being boring. And, you know, part of drinking a lot is about chasing excitement and risk and thrill. And recovery sounded very dull to me, really. Sober, what a word. It's a horrible word, you know? And so I felt like I wanted to write the book that I would have wanted to read at that time. Or maybe I wouldn't have chosen to read it, actually. I probably wouldn't have been that interested in it, but someone should have given it to me. And in terms of what I wanted to avoid offering any easy answers. Like, life is very painful and hard a lot of the time. It's also beautiful and exciting a lot of the time. Living in addiction is miserable in my experience. Living in recovery is not a magic bullet to happiness. It's a very different kind of life, and it's one that I've found much more enriching and varied. But, you know, including the story of my father's illness and including some other things that were very painful and difficult was vital, because I guess I wanted to show that it's possible to find a robust way of living free from addiction, having lived inside it and felt like that's impossible. Like, that in itself is the project of the book, I think. And that you can do it and you can survive things that your previous self would have felt impossible to get through without the fix or the security blanket of whatever your addiction is, whether it's running or smoothies, I don't know. For me, it was whiskey.
Yeah, and that living in the real, like confronting the real, is painful, but it can also be really beautiful. That's what I read in it. Is it's you like coming into the world and seeing how difficult, but also there's another level of being when you're actually just living in yourself and fully in reality.
Yeah, presence, right? It's great. Who knew? It's cracking. No, but I think it's something that, you know, like getting present, be here now, all that stuff. It's very easy for it to sound very trite and like platitudes, but actually, that is something that recovery taught me. That being alive to the present moment, you know, there's a reason it's a cliche, and I think we live in a highly sort of a society that highly incentivizes not being present, especially with our phones and I mean all the things, all the usual things that people complain about. But being sober has introduced me to a new level of presence. And I don't meditate all the time. I'm not talking about that actually, but just really coming into the body, the moment with the other person you're with, whatever it is, that is kind of much more. It's actually more risky than being drunk. And I'm a bit of a risk. I enjoy risk. And there's something inherently extremely risky about being totally present because you're not avoiding anything. It's kind of wild. I sound like an addict, don't I?
You mentioned your dad's illness, and I want to talk to you about that. It comes in a little bit later in the book. You sort of mention your dad in the first 2 chapters, but then when he's diagnosed, it becomes a big part of the story. And you have this moment where you compare Alzheimer's and addiction and what he was going through and what you were thinking about, especially in terms of memory. And I wonder if you could talk about that and why you wanted to include that in the book.
Yeah, it was very interesting to be able to give shape to something that I'd felt at the time when my father became ill, but I hadn't really put it into words. I hadn't given it a shape. But it was this very strong sense that because of my experience of addiction, and particularly, you know, blackouts when drinking and forgetfulness, and I mean, I've always had a bad memory, but I really annihilated my memory for a while there. And when my father started to change, the changes were quite subtle at the beginning, and then, I don't know, the way his illness developed, it wasn't particularly linear, it wasn't at a steady pace. Things would like lurch forward and he'd seem to lose, you know, huge parts of himself, and then some would come back and then it would slow down and then it would lurch forward again. And I recognized that motion. It was a similar shape to my experience of addiction, which was a spiral, really. And the epigraph to this book is Louise Bourgeois talking about spirals. As the spiral becomes a very important organizing principle in the work. Both my father and I had these experiences of spiraling out and winding in again, and spiraling out a bit further next time and winding in again. And I realized that there was a bridge between what I'd lived through and was trying to come back from and what he was experiencing in real time that could be useful. And there was something incredibly poignant in being able to find a purpose for that dysfunctional time in my life. And I felt like it was easier for me to meet him where he was in this kind of chaotic space than for a lot of other people in his life who had never experienced that chaos. They were more frightened of it, I think, and were less flexible with it. And I felt like there were times when I felt like we were meeting in this alternate world of surreal life. And it was very meaningful to be able to share that with him as we sort of passed each other. It really did feel like you said, like we crossed over, and there's a brief moment where we were almost on the same plane, and then I kept going in one way and he kept going in another. But Alzheimer's is a real trip, and it's different I think it manifests very differently in different people. With my dad, there were times when he did almost seem pissed. And that could be very funny, and there is a lot of humour in it. You have to find the humour, otherwise it's too unbearable for words. But the forgetfulness, as I was thinking about his story and mine and how to arrange them in the book, the line that came to me was, Alzheimer's and addiction are both diseases of forgetfulness. They're both diseases that make you intermittent to yourself and intermittent in your relationships with the people in your life, and that's what's very painful for them, not necessarily for you. And I think that was another parallel I found, that there were periods of my father's life when he was ill that were excruciating for his family, but maybe not for him, actually. I think he was kind of okay in it. And that I recognized from my time in active addiction, where I was probably fine inside myself. I was wreaking havoc elsewhere. Yeah. But you're separate from that reality, which is why, going back to what we were saying, like the kind of thrill of finding an ability to be in presence and actually be in line with what's happening externally and internally, and to bring them into communion with one another, is a very powerful thing for me personally. Probably everyone else does it more naturally.
I don't know. I think it's hard for anyone. And I think you're right. It is, your descriptions of caring for your dad, they are funny at times. They're really tender. They're sad sometimes. Like, there's so much range in terms of the experiences that you're having together. And reading this really made me think about care, and what it means to be a carer, what it means to take care of someone. And I wonder if that was on your mind as you were writing, that this idea of care and what it actually means, and having gone through it yourself, if it changed your conception of what it was.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't know it hit me when he first started getting ill. And I think that's also, there's a certain solipsism to that stage of life, right? Like mid to late 20s. You're adult, but you're not really adult a lot of the time. And it depends how you've been living. It depends what hand you've been dealt, obviously. But I think for a lot of people in my world and in my sort of situation, people with a certain amount of privilege and education and everything, we were all still babies, really, at that point, in terms of, like, responsible only for ourselves. Not really. No one had kids. No one was looking after sick parents. People had jobs, but not necessarily that much money. Like, it was a time of, it didn't necessarily feel at the time, but looking back, it was a time of immense freedom, and that's that kind of weird nostalgia that creeps in. But yeah, I was 27-ish when he started to get sick, and it definitely totally shaped the next phase of my life, because I realized I wanted to be there with him. I was able to be. I got very sort of consumed by it as well, which I think is another thing that carers of all kinds really recognize, and I don't know how you don't do it that way. Once you step into that role, somebody's needs just get bigger and bigger, and it becomes harder and harder to know where the boundary is. And, they always say, take care of yourself. I don't know anyone who's managed that. At the same time, it's very hard. But, I thought a lot about caring. I thought a lot about the fact that we just deny the fact that we are all going to be in that position if we live long enough. And maybe we won't all live long enough, but if we do, there's no avoiding it. We will need to rely on other people, whether they're our family, our friends, or the state. It's going to happen. And actually, I think in England, we have such a weird relationship to the idea of end of life. We have such a weird relationship to the idea of death and suffering and everything. And, my father had a long illness. It was sort of 8 years, all told, maybe a bit longer even. But he was highly dependent for 5 years, highly dependent. And it really reframed how I thought about aging as well, because why shouldn't we create a world that can softly receive people as they lose their ability to care for themselves? Why don't we have a system that's better set up for that? It's literally the one thing we all have in common. We're all going to die. Sorry, guys, spoiler. But we are. And we don't think hard enough about how to make the journey towards death more bearable for the person dying and for the people who love the person dying. So that's in there, you know.
Yeah.
I tried not to get on my soapbox about it too much in the book, but I'm hoping to do it at events instead.
Yeah, and how much our society does not facilitate caring. It doesn't take it seriously.
It doesn't take it
Yeah.
seriously. It's feminized still, and often it is the women in the family who step into that role still, in my experience. But also, it's something the state denies really that they should have any responsibility in, and that's a massive, massive problem as well, because it's extremely expensive. It's extremely expensive to provide the kind of 24-hour care that people with dementia certainly end up needing if they live long enough into their illness. But I think it also made me think differently about daughterhood, you know, and how you relate to your parents and how those relationships profoundly change as they age. And I had to become like a parent to my father, which was a very weird experience. Also, you know, we'd always had a good relationship, but we had periods of our lives where we'd really not been close at all, and there'd been a lot of distance between us, and other periods where I'd relied on him a lot and all of this. But what we were able to share through me being there with him was so profound, and it really recast the rest of our relationship, and actually the closeness that came from caring for his body and caring for him while he was dependent on me and my mother. You know, there were other people in the family also involved, but just speaking about my relationship with him, it was so, so meaningful. And I think, you know, I was able to be there more than if I'd had a traditional job, for example, because I was freelancing. I actually wasn't getting very much work, so I was like available, and I'm so glad I was, even though I felt incredibly out of step with my friends. I'd gone out of step with them anyway by getting sober, and then I was out of step with my friends because I was in this caring role, and I was jealous and I was angry sometimes, and I didn't want to do it sometimes, and it's very hard. And it was important that that was in the book as well, you know. I didn't want to paint some rosy picture of it.
Yeah, definitely. But I don't know. I felt that it was both not rosy and real, but also not. It felt like something where I really learned a lot and wasn't like slugging through it. Like the experience of your feeling wasn't necessarily something that came through to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Good. But so let's talk about memoir.
Okay.
This is a memoir.
It's actually a novel.
It's a memoir. And I don't know. I think if you had told me I'm writing a book, I wouldn't necessarily have guessed that it would be a memoir at first. And I suspect maybe you feel that about yourself as well. So how did you arrive at the memoir? I mean, you talked a little bit at the beginning about speaking from the heart. Was that a part of it?
I mean, no one was more surprised than me, honestly. It was a really interesting thing because it was really a bridge out of my academic writerly persona, I think. I mean, I hadn't been working in academia for a little while when I started writing, but that was my training. And the other book-length thing I wrote was a thesis, 100,000 words. It was even longer than this, actually. You can read it. It's in the British Library. It's very long. But no, that was the way I'd been trained.
Oh my God, you're super fans now. This is...
The thing with academic writing is you're not present, you're not there, the I is not a factor in it. And these various essays and sort of pieces of memoir journalism, I guess, I'd written, which had given me permission to use the first person and use the I voice. I'd been so hesitant and nervous of doing it, and then I'd done a bit of it and really enjoyed it. It felt very liberating, actually. And then, as I was thinking about these ideas and thinking about wanting to write a book about ideas, I realized that, anchoring it in my experience is more honest, because that's what has convinced me I wanted to do this, than taking some kind of distant bird's eye view voice, which didn't feel authentic to me at all. And also I wanted to bring imagination into it, which you can do when you're in yourself. I wanted to set myself the challenge of painting a psychological portrait, I guess, of the writer, which is me, but also the person in this book is a version of me. It's a cipher. It's not really me. Of course it's not. It's a conceit, a construction. That in itself is also interesting to me. And I think when I started writing and thinking and reading other memoirs more and more, and also the memoirists we've had on the show, like we've spoken to brilliant memoirists like Sinead Gleason, Maggie Nelson, you know, people who...
Viv Albertine.
The book blew my socks off. To throw away unopened, if you haven't read it, it's absolutely incredible. Like white hot exploration of her relationship with her mum, basically, and dad, but mum in particular. Also about a dying parent. Should we just do the show, actually? Should we do some book recommendations?
Space you feel more comfortable in, perhaps.
Totally, 100%. Yeah, but you know, the more memoirs I read, the more I realised it's such an elastic and exciting form, actually. And as regular listeners of the show will know, I don't like to be constrained by...
anything,
exactly, let alone genre. And yeah, I thought it was a really actually exciting place where I could write about ideas, and I could write about the self, and I could write about the unconscious and the mind and everything, actually. It's kind of a grab bag of whatever you want it to be, and if you can pull it off, then great, you know.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Sinead Gleason said when we spoke to her, amongst many other things, which was about how memoirs are sort of as much what you leave out of your life as what you include.
Yeah.
And that really helped focus my mind. You know, the experience of reading a memoir, sometimes you're like, oh my God, I can't believe this person is telling me these things. But actually, they're leaving out so much more about their experience, which doesn't mean it's not true. But I wonder if you had that relationship too when you were writing, how you set those boundaries.
Totally. You may remember some panicked phone calls, Carrie Plitt.
A few, yeah.
Yeah, it was fascinating. It was really fascinating. I found the later chapters, which are much less exposing, really, in terms of the episodes of life that are written in, much more frightening, because they're me as I am now. They're closer to me as I am now. The earlier chapters, which are about this very raw and fragile young woman, and they have some flashbacks to a couple of very poignant, very messy moments in my addiction, which maybe seem more shocking when you're reading them, especially if you don't know me. They weren't shocking or hard to write at all, because they were preserved in the sort of aspect of memory, and I'm very different from that young woman, and I mean, she's still inside me, but she's not who I am. So, and I think also the interesting thing about testimony in general, it's a big part of recovery if you go through 12-step programs, which I did, you know, sharing and talking in meetings. So I got very used to talking about my addiction and my addictive experiences in the form of testimony, and that worked its way into the book. Whereas writing about my father and my feelings about that, and also other things about my life later on, they felt so much more raw, and I would call you in a panic and be like, what am I doing? And it was just so interesting, because your perspective was always like, babe, it's fine, you know?
And it was actually so much less raw than you thought it was, almost always.
Yeah.
Which was interesting to
really
me.
Fascinating, right?
Yeah.
But there's also, you know, I wanted, because I was interested in writing about psychology and writing about the mind and the life of the mind, I knew that I wasn't necessarily going to be choosing scenes from life that were the most exciting or the most dynamic or the most like electric necessarily. It was more a way of thinking through how the inner experience shapes the outer experience. So there's a scene like in one of the later chapters where I spent a lot of time in a graveyard called Abney Park, which I'm sure loads of you know. It's an amazing place. It's also a park, not just a graveyard, but it's mainly a graveyard, to be honest. I think it's like 2,000 people buried there. It's a very atmospheric place. And I was living at the time with some friends up in Stoke Newington, and I kept finding myself in front of the same grave. And it's a huge place. It's weird to keep finding yourself in front of the same grave. I don't know why, but it was the dead people, were called Lancelot and Rose Wiles.
We all die, people.
We all die. Maybe my next iteration is as a death doula. I think I'm quite interested in it, actually. Anyway, poor old Lancelot and Rose died a long time ago, and actually seemed to have broken out of their tomb. And I kept finding myself there, compelled by it. And so that's in the book. It's not a very interesting thing in some ways, right? Like I'm just standing in front of this grave, Lancelot and Rose are not there, whatever. But I wanted to think about why that happened, and it was a metaphor for all sorts of things. And I'm a Jungian, I guess, in some ways. So, and I a little Freudian, a little fruity Freudian over here. There are no coincidences, I believe, and I thought that was interesting. And that is a much more controlled thing to bring into a book than, say, me writing about a massive argument I had with someone, or I don't know, something that might be more plotty.
Yeah.
That if I was writing a novel, I would definitely put in.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's what Sinead said is totally right, and I think the skill is crafting it so that, I don't know. I know there are memoirists out there who believe that the only way to be true to the form is to give everything. I don't believe that. I think that kind of writing is extraordinary and can be remarkable. I am not that kind of writer. So I think, again, that's what I love about memoir. It's elastic enough to make room for the truly confessional writers who do that electrically, brilliantly well, and then those of us who maybe want to try something a bit different. And I think part of figuring out how you want to write about your life is learning what is comfortable for you and what is interesting for you as the writer, as well as what's interesting for the reader. And then finding out whether you've got the balance right. Is it satisfying for the reader? Have you given enough of yourself? Perhaps you haven't, and then you maybe have to find more ways to do that. But I don't think you have to give anything you don't want to give. And the skill is finding out how to make something interesting without pushing yourself. And I think politically that's very important for women especially.
Yeah, and in fact, I'd written down a quote from your book that at one point you tell a story, and it's a little bit later on in the book, and you write, "I hesitated to include the story here, where it might become a commodity, a silver coin in the confessional economy that thrives on tales of feminine dysfunction." I thought that was really interesting. I liked that you were sort of thinking through also what to include within the book, and I think that gives a taste of like how many layers of thought there are, but still the clarity of the thought. So can you talk about what you meant by that and sort of the thinking that went into including that line, but also including the story?
Definitely. I'm glad you asked. Given this some thought. Yeah, I felt like I wanted to, as much as I could, I wanted to call in some of these questions about what the memoir is and what the role of the memoir is. So there's a whole strand in here as well about archetypes and about mythology, Dionysus and Artemis figure, and that's like a little wink to myself, I guess, of saying like self-mythologizing is a dangerous thing to do. It's something that memoir encourages, the memoir industry encourages. We all also enjoy it, I think. Like sometimes it's amazing to read a memoir that just is pure self-mythology and total kind of narcissistic braggadocio. Like I love it. However, I didn't want to fall into that trap, and I think the ego can swell and take you in that direction. So I was trying to call that in, and in the passage you're talking about, there was this thing that happened. I had a motorbike accident. I made some wonky choices afterwards, and it's quite a sort of dramatic story, and I put it in the book. I hesitated about it because, as the quote you read sort of says, it's like, books are commodities. They exist in the market. You pay money and you take it away. So whatever is in a book is also, by dint of that, a commodity in a way. Not only, not exclusively, but it is. So when you put your mangled body on the page, and then you put it into a commodity, and then you sell it, what are you doing? What's your motivation for doing that? When you write a memoir, you have the choice to present yourself to however many readers are going to pick it up. What is motivating you to choose to put yourself in that light and not this light? How do you think carefully about that? Are you being manipulative? Are you being honest? Are you leaning towards market forces that shape how you think without you realizing, which is the kind of confessional economy, and why I wanted to call in the reader as well in that section, because
Yeah, it's like, what are you here for?
Yeah, what are you here for? Exactly. And have I given it to you? And am I going to or not? You know, I wanted to have a slightly playful relationship with the reader in places in the book, because that's what I like as a reader. I enjoy that when I'm reading. But yeah, I don't necessarily have answers to those questions. I still don't know how I feel about that in the book or in myself. And I'm certainly not here to sort of make blanket statements about it, but I think it's something I try and bear in mind, especially when I read life writing and memoir. What am I going there for? Am I being prurient? Probably a little bit. Is that okay? Yeah, kinda. But like, for the writer, where do you land on those questions as well? I think it's an important thing to have in mind.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about love.
Oh, babe.
Which is a big part of this book. And a lot of different kinds of love as well. Self-love, familial love for your father, of course, but for the rest of your family. And finally, the love you find with your partner called Jay.
The enigmatic Jay.
Yes. So I love this quote. If love was to be more than a fix, it had to be the kind that could withstand reality, not the kind that needs to escape it to survive. So can you talk about that? Because I thought that was beautiful.
Thank you. I stand by it. Yeah, love was an important thing. Love was an important thing in this book, as you say, sort of self-love and finding a way to accept that self-love is not cringe and terrible, but actually like quite a good thing. And obviously, the love for my family, for my father in particular, which is also a love that came, it was drawn out by demonstration, by care, by attention. It's a very distilled version of love that comes in an extremely tangible way, which I think in the parent-child relationship, it doesn't really exist for large swathes of your life. Of course, when you're a child, your parents' love towards you is given in that way, and it's attention to your body and it's attention to your every need, right? And then you have this long period where you're independent and they're independent, and you don't pay attention to each other in that way, I think, a lot of the time, and then it shifts again. But then this other thing that happened, which I didn't know I was going to write about, it was very surprising to me.
It really surprised me when I read the book. I mean, not that I didn't, I had no idea you were writing about it. It was a lovely surprise.
Yeah, it really... Yeah. So I met someone. He's here tonight. His name is Jay. His name is John. John, sorry, I can't do it anymore. John is here tonight, and I'm going to really embarrass him by telling this story. Basically, I had been on my own for a long time, and loneliness and solitude are a big part of this book as well. Addiction was an extremely lonely experience. Caring was also a bizarrely lonely experience. Maybe not bizarrely, it was lonely. Alzheimer's is a very lonely disease for everybody who is in its orbit. And I was really, very happily on my own for a long time. And then, not so happily on my own and a bit lonely and thinking I would like to meet somebody. I'm really not expecting it to happen at all because I was dealing with my dad and myself, and that felt like enough, hands full of two quite complicated people. And then a very old friend who's also here tonight got married, and I was her bridesmaid, and again, was really not expecting to meet anyone at this wedding. I was working. And then I did. I met somebody on the dance floor, and it began this relationship, which was a very different kind of relationship from the ones I'd had before, which were all about escaping reality and running headlong into something very intense. And this relationship developed in a very different way, and I realized it couldn't not be in the book, because to be truthful about recovery and what is recovered and what I found was recovered was this openness to connection that I'd lost and that addiction took from me anyway. And also, when I first started dealing with Dad's illness, I really thought, okay, well, I'm not going to be in love or anything like that until he's died. How can I hold those two experiences? And the universe had other ideas, I guess, but it was possible, and I wanted to write about it because it was interesting to me that it was possible. And I think that's another thing really I wanted to say about this book, is just that, it's about some really difficult things, it's about some really sad things, it's also about some happy things, but mainly it's about things that I find interesting. And I think that's a good motivation for a writer. You know, are you interested? Can you maintain your own interest? Then maybe you'll maintain the interest of a reader, hopefully. But the same with love. I think love is a very interesting topic. It's something that we all have in our lives or feel the loss of at different times. It's something that waxes and wanes. And the kind of love that can withstand reality, whether that's with friends or lovers or partners or parents, whatever, that's the kind that can hold you through these really challenging experiences. So that's the kind I sort of realized I wanted to cultivate in recovery. And in addiction, I really wasn't very interested in.
I can think of an earlier version of you not wanting to write about romance at all.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's part of why it surprised me.
Yeah. Well, it was a representation of a softening that happened over that time, I think. To be open to it and to be open to writing about it and not think it was sappy or, you know, yeah, I evolved, baby.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about your experiences, but this book is filled with so many other voices and ideas and, you know, places as discussed. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so rich, is that you're weaving your experience with the wisdom and the thoughts of other writers and thinkers and artists. It's really wonderful. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the experience of incorporating those voices. And maybe I wanted to ask you specifically about Louise Bourgeois, because she's a very important part of this book. The epigraph, as you mentioned, is from her, and she kind of reappears, and maybe use that as an example of how you thought about incorporating other people.
Louise Bourgeois is kind of, I think of her as like the godmother of this book. Maybe she's one godmother and Simone Weil is the other godmother. So I lucked out with these two. Yeah, Louise Bourgeois is a big figure in my life generally, but she had to be there because I was writing about the life of the mind and a bit about my thesis and this thing I spent so many years kind of bashing my head against and getting very deep into, thinking about hysteria. Of course, this is also a book about hysteria, which I didn't realize until I finished writing it. But, you know, academics tend to be writing about things that they're obsessed with in some other deeper way and necessarily don't, you know, recognize that. And of course, hysteria and addiction have a lot to do with each other. Like, of course they do. Anyway, that's a story for another time, maybe. But the Louise Bourgeois thing, when I wrote my thesis, I was writing about Spanish film, 3 male directors, hysteria in their films, whatever, and I wanted to have a strong feminine counterpart to these masculine explorations of it. And Louise Bourgeois was the artist that came to mind, and she was referenced in one of the films I was writing about, so that kind of brought her in. It worked neatly in the thesis, but the relationship I developed with her work when I was researching my thesis went way, way deeper than, way deeper than the work. And she became a kind of guide in a strange way. I felt a very, very mad affinity with her. And I think I'm interested in that power that writers and artists can have on us. And when you find a creator who... Creator makes it sound like God. When you find a mind that makes tangible, whether it's in words or in paint or in marble, an experience that you recognize, personally, there's nothing more powerful. And to me, that's like the sublime. And I had that with Louise Bourgeois, the way that she thinks about turmoil, really, and lust and shame and like these elemental experiences of life. And I was interested in bringing that in personally because it was true to this time in my life. I was thinking about her a lot. Her work had a big sort of impact on how I looked at recovery and how I thought about it when I was living it in real time, but also because I wanted to make a generous object. You know, like we talk about the commodity, I wanted it to be a gift to a reader as much as it could be, and that meant going way beyond myself because I'm not arrogant enough to think that that's the gift. I wanted it to be populated by as many other thinkers and makers as my mind is populated by all the time, because I think it's an enriching way to be and to sort of live. So there are lots and lots of voices in here. It was a nightmare when it came to the permissions at the end. Absolute hell. But luckily my publisher, the team at Canongate, were brilliant with that. But yeah, maybe I'll just quickly read a little bit with Louise Bourgeois, because it probably explains it a little better than I can. So this is in the second chapter when I was in New York, where I went for a research trip for 3 months, and I was in the archives at MoMA specifically to research Louise Bourgeois. So I was staying with some friends in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Stepping back out into the dense July heat of the Lower East Side, I wonder if Louise Bourgeois might help me to get real. In 1938, she moved to New York from Paris and lived in the city until her death in 2010. It was the site of her reckonings and her emancipation. She was an artist who transfigured her biggest emotions into things you could see and touch, shame into marble, disgust into bronze. Her practice was a dedicated excavation of the depths of her psyche, but although she spent years in psychoanalysis, her relationship with it was ambivalent. For Bourgeois, art offered greater respite. Art is a guarantee of sanity, promises my favourite of her drawings. Its scribbled letters are blocked in with purpose in pencil the colour of sensible lipstick, on paper the candy pink shade of angel delight. This piece speaks to me in all tenses, to the little girl whose favourite colour was, in spite of herself, pink, 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 and to the young woman now trying to see her own life as something worth guaranteeing at all. Every day you have to abandon your past or accept it, and then, if you cannot accept it, you become a sculptor, Bourgeois said. And then, if you cannot accept it, you become a writer, I thought. And then, if you cannot accept it, you go to New York.
Another cliffhanger. Read the book. As a last question, I want to ask you a little bit more about the construction of this book, about how it took shape, about how you found the voice and edited the voice and got to the voice that you wanted to write, and what that process was like.
This is a question heavily informed by experience, because I was in touch with you a lot when I was struggling with the voice. It took a minute. I mean, initially, that first burst of sort of 3,000 words, the voice was very clear and it was very strong and it was very immediate and comfortable. It felt right in a profound way. And I thought, great, I've cracked it. This is going to be fine. And then I lost it because it was very important to me that the voice shifted. At the beginning, I didn't want it to be subtle. I wanted it to be kind of cataclysmic across the book. So I was writing each chapter in a very different voice, using different things. It was very chaotic. It was, honestly, looking back, I think a lack of confidence, kind of trying to put all the bells and whistles in at once to see if I could show off, basically, and then not have to reveal anything, I think really was what was going on. But yeah, like the first chapter was this sort of quite dreamy set piece, and then the second chapter in New York was totally stream of consciousness and very chaotic, and it was a later chapter which was based on recordings I'd made of my dad and I talking over the course of his illness, which I wrote totally in dialogue, and someone wiser than me read it and said, I think this would make a good radio play, but maybe it's not quite right for the book. I think I thought it was Beckett, basically, for a second. Anyway, I just did it, and I made a mess, and you have to make a mess before you can make something good, I think, generally. So I made a mess, and I made a bigger mess, and I made an even bigger mess, and then realized it was just chaos, and it was not exciting chaos. It was just messy. And went back to the voice from the first chapter and held onto it more consciously, and didn't expect it to just carry me through. Actually had a relationship with it, I guess, and tried to bring that through everything I'd written already, and it worked, and it picked up momentum, and actually all the mess and the experiments informed it. And I think it does shift over the course of the book, but not in a way that is the front runner, I guess. And I've had a few readers say that they could sense that and they felt the shift, and that was very gratifying. I was glad it was still there. But I think it's very difficult to maintain voice over the length of a whole book, especially when the terrain of the book is changing a lot, which was vital to this, both in the strands about me and the strands about my dad.
Yeah, and to strip away
all of the things you don't need to find that clarity, which I really feel you've landed at.
Thank you, that's wonderful.
On that note, thank you, everyone. You've been an amazing audience, and it's just so exciting to be here.
It's really, I'm like bowled over by how many of you are here. Thank you so much. And thank you, Carrie, for being the best whip cracker I know. And thank you, Pages, as well. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
If you would like to buy this Ragged Grace, please head to our website pagesofhackney.co.uk, or you can buy it for collection from the bookshop or for delivery nationwide. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe wherever you find your podcasts for more literary events like this one.